Good morning. So, welcome to our third and final day of our conference. We'll just get started with our speakers. Our first speaker is Stephen Ekovich from the American University of Paris, speaking on cultural resistance and assimilation in the French Empire.
Thank you, David. Before I start, I would like to explain why I'm interested in this. For most of my adult life, if I count my military service in Vietnam, in the intelligence service, I've spent most of my life, 50 years, wandering around the French Empire. That's also partly because I have, at the behest of the American State Department, for example, been to almost every French-speaking country in Africa to run workshops, either trying to explain American politics. The Americans do this. They let professors have free speech and explain and even criticize in front of diplomats American policy, American politics. But also there was the period when the Americans were interested in democratization. And so I often did democracy workshops, not only in Africa, but also in the former Soviet sphere. And the way I did that, I never lectured at Africans about democracy. I would open up a safe space for discussion, so they would discuss among themselves, and I would learn that way also. And most recently, the American State Department has focused on young. There's always a day that's dedicated to the young generation. So over 50 years, I've had experience with, I would say, 3 generations of Africans. But also, on one side of my wife's family is a Creole family from Guadeloupe. So just through family connections, I've had a long experience with the French West Indies and the literature of the French West Indies. So I'm going to change the title slightly of my presentation today. It will be the resistance, assimilation, resistance, and I'll use the French word métissage. There's not really a good translation into English of métissage. In a more general sense, it could be translated as a kind of hybridization, a kind of mixing. The word mestizo doesn't quite work because it's too biological. So I will use of métissage, which the Francophone authors have also adopted in that broader sense of cultural mixing. So so it will be assimilation, resistance, and transformation, let's call it, French discourses. So I'm going to kind of present an intellectual history, a history of ideas, of the way the French themselves, or no, not the French, but French speakers have tried to come to grips with their empire. And that's mostly going to be from the perspective of African writers and Caribbean writers and the writers of the diaspora. If you go to Paris today, in some neighborhoods, you are in the French Empire. The French wanted an empire. The empire is in Paris. So there's also a diaspora literature that's increasingly present in the French literary scene. So I'm going to look at French discourses, not only literature, anthropology, philosophy. We have more and more African philosophers, the Francophone African philosophers, who are trying also to come to an understanding of their relationship to the center. They're from the periphery, and they've been working on attempts to understand their position and the position of their cultures in the French Empire. So I'll just work on 2 general axes without going into details. I will mention a few authors, because I think I should, because some of them really have written masterpieces in French. In fact, I would say that in many ways, some of the most vibrant French literature of the past 10 or 15 years, even more, has come from the periphery, from Africa, and particularly from the Caribbean, from the Antilles. I use the term Antilles because that's the way the French use it, and I think we say it in English like the Antilles. So on 2 axes, one is Uh, in general, I think we can categorize these attempts because writers, the French discourse has in a very large part worked on binaries that Russell mentioned at the very beginning of the conference. The binaries that characterize this literature in a broad sense, that these French discourses try to deal with the relationship between universals and particulars, the general with the singular, modern and traditional, or these days postmodern and traditional, and even most recently hyper-modern and traditional, uniformization and the personal, the global and the local, totalized and the specific. So those of you who have some familiarity with the French mode of expository thinking, where generally there's been work on either one side of those binaries or the other, or more generally, and this is the French method that French students are taught, you have your thesis and your antithesis and then your synthesis. So we'll see that in general terms, in a synchronic fashion, all of this literature adopts this French rhetorical style. Even, of course, the elites from the periphery, who France brought to France. Well, one of the ironies of the history of the French Empire is that France deliberately sought out the most talented members of the periphery, brought them to France, brought them to Paris to begin with, gave them the best education that France even gives its own best talent, and of course they learned the French discursive method at mostly not at French universities. You know, in France there's a separation between what the French call the grande école, which really prepares the future elite, and the university. So France brought from the Caribbean, from Africa, the members of those communities that they identified as the most talented, the most promising political leaders, and indeed they did become important political leaders, but they led the revolution and the resistance to the French Empire. So France trained, educated its own antithesis, its own resistance in a very large measure. Those are the binaries. That's the general methodological framework, and now it's important to move it through time, to give that discursive style a diachronic dimension. And most of the histories of French literature, the French literature from the periphery, from the empire, identifies several phases. These phases are a phase of attempted assimilation and views of the French Empire from the point of view of the metropolitan center. This begins with the empires of the kings, already in the 17th century. Then we go through a phase of resistance, then to this phase of mixing or métissage, and curiously, and this is where I'm going to end up, we come back to a phase of assimilation, but assimilation at a different level, after having gone through a hybridization or a synthesis of those relationships between the center and the periphery. The first literature, of course, is the literature of the explorers and the missionaries. Actually, French missionaries were the first ethnologists, already beginning in the 17th century. So the first history of Guadeloupe, for example, is by the Father Labat, the Père Labat, who wrote a multi-volume history of the society in Guadeloupe, including the original indigenous society in the island. The same for Africa. The earliest anthropologists were missionaries who were attempting to understand African cultures and their religions in order to better, more effectively Christianize. But here we have an ambiguity. It's an interesting ambiguity because at one and the same time, they had there were many who had a real humane devotion to the Africans, and they attempted to understand the African. I would say they were the first structuralists, trying to understand the structure of African beliefs, animist beliefs for the most part, and partly Islam also, in order to better Christianize these populations. We encounter a lot of ambiguities in this literature. So that's the first phase, and these phases overlap. We have the same approach, the description from the point of view of the colonizer, all throughout the different empires, the royal empires, the empires of the different republics of France, up through, of course, including today. The approach of the point of view of the colonizer. A lot of literature, for example, dealing with the West Indies, is an exotic literature, and the Caribbean authors refer back to an interesting essay by Victor Segalaun, exotism, with the Antilles authors call this doo-doo literature because doo-doo is like a rough translation is like cute or charming. They see this as the projection of an attempt to find something exotic without actually penetrating the cultures of the West Indies, or for Africa for that matter. So there is a reaction, particularly among the colonized, against this sort of doo-doo literature, this charming exoticism. So the part of this literature of assimilation, actually, in the early phases of colonization, the colonized often accepted the hegemony, the cultural hegemony of France. And many of the Africans saw themselves as French, just simply French. And of course, the goal of the education of France was to make them French, and to turn them into Frenchmen, or to turn them into well, in some cases in the history of the Third Republic, to turn them into French citizens. You know that in some places of Africa, there was actual representation in the French National Assembly during the Third Republic, which was the case of many of the French leaders who later became the leaders of their own independent country. So some of this literature accepted French hegemony, the French culture, the culture of the center. They just wanted to make the relationship better, more humane, less violent, less aggressive. Their idea was to humanize this relationship while at the same time maintaining their conception of being French. Of course, there was a rejection of that, a reaction against that, and we get that first reaction. We get the most virulent reactions against that from these elites educated in France. They go to France feeling that they're really visiting their mother country. I mean, you find that in the writing of not only the authors of Maghreb, but of Africa, but also of the Caribbean. They feel like, in some ways, intellectually, they're going home because they've been already raised in the French lycée in these countries. The École Républicaine, they've already been raised. They've learned this literature. Of course, they're quickly disabused because when they arrive in Paris, because of the color of their skin, they come up against all kinds of discrimination. So there's a reaction against this. And they react not completely against French civilization, the French intellectual trend, because they do adopt currents of Western thought that are also critical of the West. So, of course, they quickly adopt Marxism and Surrealism and Freud That goes together, of course, with surrealism, because they're looking for something rather other than the Cartesian rationality to attempt to explain their position vis-a-vis the metropolitan center. So one of the leading, there were two leading scholars in this who become very important political players later. That's Aimé Césaire, whose very famous poem, a surrealist poem, written in and published in the 1930s, A Return to My Native Land, Retour au Pays Natal, is still widely read, and it's extremely difficult poetry. And the other is Leopold Senghor, who also adopts these approaches, but Leopold Senghor, who's African, and who can rely on African traditions. The major fracture here is between the Caribbean, where there is very small vestiges, if anything, of the previous African cultures, whereas in Africa, the African writers can draw on their own indigenous cultures and intellectual traditions. And Leopold Senghor does that. Leopold Senghor tries to find something that's African in his relationship to France. That's his attempted synthesis. Of course, the first reaction leads to the creation of an oppositional approach called negritude. The idea is that there's something about a black culture, a black soul, an African soul that's fundamentally in opposition to the West. The reaction against that from the next generation is that it's too totalizing. Jean-Paul Sartre also, yeah. What does that mean? The negritude is rejected by the next generation because it's seen as too totalizing, and we come back to a literature that tries to find roots in local cultures, be it Africa or the Caribbean. So now we have the literature of creolization, trying to define a world, a West Indian world, for example. And it's interesting to note here, this rejection of negritude includes authors. One of the authors that the Caribbean writers accept is Saint-Jean Perse, who's the son of a plantation owner. They see Perse as one of their own. The most recent literature of métissage, and I'll just do this briefly, is from anthropologists. The most interesting, I think, most recent work is by an anthropologist called Jean-Loup Amsel, who's gone beyond an interpretation of métissage, and who views the relationship among all cultures, for that matter, as what he calls branchement. Branchement in French means you plug in to a flow of electrons. For Amsel, what cultures are doing, and how anthropologists should understand culture, is connecting into a dense universe of signs, of signifiers. So what he's saying is that every culture adopts signifiers from the West, and they create signifiers that are specific to their own culture, but nevertheless have connected to the this universal signifiers. And just one other thing, because I wanted to mention this for Wayne. Amsel says that there are what's dangerous about Afrocentrism or any kind of centrism is that there are traditions that are created to try to find origins. And to the extent that creating origins is trying to find some sort of cultural purity, he sees this as dangerous. He tries to explain the genocides of Africa in the past 20 years from this. To the extent that there's an attempt to create an original, pure culture, the ultimate defense of that pure culture is a violent defense of that culture. I'll come back to other things later, but I didn't mean to include my personal presentation as part of the presentation.
Our next speaker is then Silvana Kandel from the University of Haifa, and she'll be speaking. Her title is "Between Center and Periphery in the Levinas Dussel Debate: A Philosophy of Otherness or a Praxis of Liberation from Imperialism."
The Argentinian philosopher and theologian Enrique Dussel was one of the many young South American intellectuals who had studied in Europe during the 60s, and that experience fostered in them a process of discovering their own Latin American identity. Dussel will describe it as, "I wished passionately to go to Europe, and going toward it, I had discovered forever the peripheral world that had been until then beyond my horizon." This process will give birth to what was later known as the philosophy of liberation, being Dussel one of its founders and the most prominent exponent, together with Juan Carlos Scannone, the Argentinian priest who brought Emmanuel Levinas, the Jewish Lithuanian French philosopher, into Latin America. Dussel and Scannone, they finished their studies in Europe and came back to Argentina, and in 1970, together with a group of young university teachers, they organized a seminar of philosophy in a first attempt of trying to articulate philosophical foundations for their intuitions. And following Scannone's advice, they started to study Levinas' book Totality and Infinity, an essay on exteriority, nine years after its first publication in 1961. Dussel will later say or write about this moment of revelation in these words. "When I first read Levinas' book Totality and Infinity, I deeply felt a subversive derangement of everything I had learned until then. Under this strong impression, a year later, Dussel traveled again to Europe and met with Levinas in two significant meetings in 71 and 72 in Paris and Louvain. Those meetings would repeatedly be mentioned in many of his future works, and although with some contradictions in the details. Levinas will also recall these meetings more than a decade after in an interview in 84, when he was asked about the attempt that had been made, especially in Latin America, to establish a synthesis of his philosophy and Marxism. Levinas responded, "I knew Enrique Dussel, who used to quote me a lot, and who is now much closer to political, even geopolitical thought. Moreover, I have gotten to know a very sympathetic group of South Americans working out the liberation philosophy, Scannone in particular. We had a meeting here with Bernard Casper, a friend of mine, who is a professor of theology at Fribourg, and some Catholic philosophers from South America. There is a very interesting attempt in South America to return to the spirit of the people. Moreover, there is a great influence of Heidegger in the manner, the rhythm of developing topics, and in the radicalism of the questioning." And Levinas says, "I am very happy, very proud even, when I hear the echoes of my work in this group. This is a fundamental approval. It means that other people have also seen the same thing." And in these words, we can feel both the proximity and the distance that characterizes the influence of Levinas' work in this nascent new trend of liberation philosophy. And some scholars will say that the influence was also other way around, that Levinas was also influenced by the Latin Americans, but it still needs further investigation. Dussel, on whom we are focusing, found in Levinas' conception of totality the theoretical foundation for his enterprise of rethinking South America. However, their paths began to split when Dussel turned to think about how to translate this philosophy into real politics, while Levinas' aim, at least in this book, is to rethink and to renew metaphysics and not politics. And what is this theoretical foundation provided by Levinas? Levinas understands totality as an ontological imperialism, as the assimilation of all alterity into the sameness of the self, the eradication of all differences. And in his words, the relation with being that is enacted as ontology consists in neutralizing the existent in order to comprehend and grasp it. It is hence not a relation with the other as such, but the reduction of the other to the same. Such is the definition of freedom, to maintain oneself against the other, despite every relation with the other, to ensure the autarky of the I. Thematization and conceptualization, which moreover are inseparable, are not peace with the other, but suppression or possession of the other. For possession affirms the other, but within a negation of its independence. I think comes down to I can, to an appropriation of what is, to an exploitation of reality. And then he will say, it issues in the state and in the non-violence of the totality without securing itself against the violence from which this non-violence lives, and which appears in the tyranny of the state. And he says universality will be impersonality and another kind of inhumanity. By this reduction of the other to the same, totality neutralizes the existence and brings to a situation of domination. Our understanding of freedom is based on this ontological imperialism. The other is for Levinas the absolutely other, a complete stranger that escapes my grasp and any possibility of domination by me. And this will be a point of distinction between Levinas, for whom the other is absolutely other, and Dussel, which says that is a tragic mistake to refer to the other as absolutely other. To introduce individuality into universality generates an act of dehumanization. So, and that is why ontological imperialism is, which is embodied in the state and in politics as totalizing systems, is imperialism. And it's what he calls a permanent state of war. Politics as a state of permanent war. But he will say that he doesn't stay in the state of war. He finds a way to break this totality in the face-to-face encounter. Levinas wants to point a deeper level in which metaphysics relies. It is the primary level of the I who, by going toward the other in desire and goodness, experiences the fertility of being. And that is what Levinas calls peace. It's the peace of the I going toward the other and in a situation of fertility. Three elements from Levinas' metaphysics will be taken by Dussel. The radical and well-articulated criticism of Western philosophy that Dussel thought he found in Levinas, although it is not clear, it's doubtful if it was Levinas' intention to so hardly criticize a philosophy, but Dussel found it in him, exemplified in Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger as a philosophy of totality, domination, and imperialism. The suggestion of a new metaphysics of alterity based on my ethical obligation toward the other. And three, the reaffirmation of the self, Dussel will say a cultural self, identity as the first step for liberation. From now on, not only could Levinas' metaphysics of alterity be applied to individuals, but to the exteriority of third world peoples, nations, and cultures marginalized by the history of the world as well. And the vibrant imperative to politicize ontology, as Dussel calls it, Dussel will move from individual ethics to an ethical historical act of a people subject of liberation. The philosophy of liberation, of which Dussel, as I said, is one of the reference, was the last matrix of several local trends of thought that started to emerge in the 60s and the early 70s in Latin America as a reaction against extremely delicate political and socioeconomic situation in Latin American countries. That's United States interventionist politics, internal political instability, and the succession of coups d'etat that interrupted the democratic processes, political violence, and increasing poverty and inequality. And in this turbulent context, and still very much after the the effects of the Cuban Revolution of '59 and a very very violent coup d'etat in Argentina in '66. Um, all this provoked a radicalization of the Latin American thinking, bringing the traditional left, which is communist and socialist, together with the populist, the Peronist, which is the party of General Juan Domingo Perón, that were not left or not communist, but they also engaged together in a very anti-imperialistic and pro-revolution messages. And the Argentinian intellectuals took the Sartre's imperative on the author's commitment as being those who had to bring become the voice of those who don't have a voice. And Enrique Dussel was one of them. Although Dussel repeatedly mentions how grateful he is with Levinas for providing him with the basic philosophical concepts on which pillars he has constructed his building, he also likes to constantly remark that there is a huge difference between them. In a book called Latin American Liberation Theology and Emmanuel Levinas, published in '75, he goes back to the encounter in Paris and tells it from his side. He says, while speaking with Levinas in Paris at the beginning of '71, I could verify the degree of similarity of our thinking with that of the French philosopher. But at the same time, the radical rupture that already then had occurred. He told me how the great political experiences of his generation had been the presence of Stalin and Hitler, two dehumanizing totalizations, fruit of the European Hegelian modernity. But by indicating that not only the great experience of my generation, but of the last half millennium has been the ego of European modernity, the conqueror and the colonialist ego, imperial in its culture and oppressor of the peoples of the periphery, he could not help to accept that he had never thought that the other, autre, could be an Indian, an African, or an Asian. The other of totality, or the European world, were all cultures and men who had been constituted as things at hand instruments, known ideas, and like now it was Europe, now it's Russia and America. And he continues as another quote, Levinas, as a Jewish thinker, could find in his existential experience a point of exteriority that enabled him to criticize totality, of the totality of European thinking, but, and that was interesting, on the other hand, he had not suffered Europe in its totality, and its holding point was still Europe itself, while we Latin Americans, Africans and Asians have suffered Europe properly. So beyond the question about the veracity of the testimony, I think it's quite strange to accuse someone who has spent 5 years in a camp of prisoners of war during World War II and who has lost his family in the Holocaust of not having suffered Europe in its totality. There is here maybe trying to appropriate the monopoly of oppression or suffering. And this is a thing that Dussel was accused of, together with Latin American philosophers, that this the kind of hubris of we peripheral thinkers are the only one who know what suffer is, and no European or Northern can understand it. And but and Dussel points this very clearly in the European being not being able to break with totality. And he says the difference between Latin Americans or peripheral and European thinkers is that the European think that there are two kinds of societies. One society is the actual society, and the other is the ideal, unreachable society. And Latin Americans, we see there are three kinds. It's the actual bad society, there is the messianic ideal society, and there is a society which can be liberated now. It's a possible that exists. So I think that this difference of Dussel trying to create the theoretical basis for a new politics, rather than Levinas trying to rise up the primal ethical claim of the other beyond or before politics, is due to their geographical presence, but also with their religious and substantial conception. Dussel being a Christian believer, very strong Christian believer, and Levinas coming from a Jewish background. I think they complement and they also are very separate.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Gideon, Northwest University, South Africa. This paper is entitled Roads Must Fall, Poverty, Property and Power, the Imperial Legacy and Constitutional Narrative of Post-Apartheid South Africa.
Hi, good morning. I would like to thank Telos for inviting me, and I've learned a tremendous amount from the other speakers. And my paper starts with Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He had arrived in the Cape Colony in 1870 and had gone into diamond trade, and by 1888 he had gained control of the De Beers mine diamond monopoly, a company which still today, except for the Australian pink diamonds, still have a monopoly on all diamond trade. And he was at the height of the British Empire, and in his will, which also created the Rhodes Scholarships, he wrote that the Anglo-Saxon race was the first race in the world, and the more of the world that we can settle, the better for the human race. He also had a secret society earlier, it was not in his final will, in which he had foreseen that not only the Holy Land and Australia and Africa, but also, he says, the entire South America should be taken by this Anglo-Saxon British race for the betterment of the world. My paper, which I will probably not succeed in covering in 15 minutes, I look at the issues on pre-colonialism, then colonialism and the trade, the diamonds, the gold, then the South African Union becoming an industrial state, and then apartheid and the Cold War, because the spectre of the Soviet Union and the liberation struggles towered over us in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Then we had Mandela and the Rainbow Nation and the transformation South Africa experience, which is in many ways remarkable. And then I engaged with what are the foundational myths of a society, and how does the ideas of modernity and enlightenment and nationalism actually find and also not find its existence in Africa and in the developing world and in South Africa. Then I deal with the Roads Must Fall, hashtag Roads Must Fall, protests from the student movement starting in 2015, which started with the first excrement being thrown at the statue of Rhodes, which was on the University of Cape Town premises. Rhodes had donated all the land and a lot of the money for the University of Cape Town. And then the difficulty with the university managements engaging with almost amorphous student protest movement, which then ultimately ended up with a level of chauvinism and then essentialism and engaging in the kind of racism that you spoke about purity. And then the bigger question is, what is the nature of law and democracy, and how can we, actually in South Africa, but also as an example of a complex society, bring this together in a system of law and justice? And there I look at redistribution and recognition in developing the ideas around justice. South Africa is a very complex society, and our origins, in a sense, go back a long way. And if we start with pre-colonial Africa, about which there's not much knowledge, and I'm certainly not much qualified to speak about it. And because it's oral culture and oral tradition, there is not that much information, and it needs to be researched. And certainly the university systems, when we were confronted with the Rhodes Must Fall protests, had to acknowledge that we have not, in fact, as people who develop and produce and bring knowledge, have not actually engaged very successfully in relation to pre-colonial African identities. South Africa is complex because, in a sense, it starts with the Portuguese Empire, reaching out, trying to get around Africa. Bartholomew Dias accidentally stumbled over Cape Town. He called it Cabo das Tormentas because it has terrible weather. But when the Portuguese king heard about it, he was so happy, he changed it to Cabo de Boa Esperanza, Cape of Good Hope. But he didn't experience the weather in Cape Town when he said that. There was also then the Portuguese viceroy in 1510 who had a run-in with the Khoi and was actually killed in a battle with the Khoi. The difficulty around First Nations discourses in South Africa is that only the Khoi, and there's big debates about that, there are now writers who say that the term Khoisan is incorrect, the term that the whites used in relation to these people, I won't say it because it's not considered pejorative. So there are big debates about who is Khoi, who is Khoisan, and who are then in fact the first peoples. And then the Nguni, the African people, were also migrating into the southern part of Africa. So one can have very unproductive debates about who was where first. So I tend not to get into that debate because it's not that actually useful to answer the questions about how are we going to go from here. But the fact is that we have this complex history starting with the Portuguese and then the Dutch and then the British. But in some ways I like starting, also because I also teach international trade law in my other existence, I like starting with the book Mare Liberum by Grotius, one of the founding fathers of Roman Dutch law, which is important in our legal system. And Mare Liberum is Freedom of the Seas, written in 1609. And it was a dispute between the Dutch and the Portuguese, because the Portuguese had their adoption of Mare Clausum, of the closed sea. And the embryonic colonial states of the time were trying to claim the sea in the same way as land. So what would happen is all the famous explorers that you'd heard about were basically just pirates with armed pirate flag. So you would come across another ship laden full of benefits from the East Indies, and you would capture them on the basis that they were sailing in your sea. And you would basically steal their stuff and then sell them in your marketplace. So you could read Grotius in writing at the start of the notion of international law, saying that the sea is, in a sense, like the air. It is, in fact, open to everybody. You cannot trespass in the open sea, and that every nation is free to travel to other nations and trade with it. So this innocent right of passage at sea is then central to international law, but also enabling lawful, and I put that in quotation marks, colonial exploitation, because the sea belongs to everybody and not to a particular nation that can claim control of it. The The Cape was settled by the Dutch East India Company, the DOC. So that was not settled by the Dutch government. It was settled by a company for its economic purposes. But then we became a place where migrants came, where refugees came. My own families came forebears came as French Huguenots after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and as Protestants had to flee France, and some came to Southern Africa. And and we gave the world the word refugee. Over the next few hundred years, and I make the distinction between colonialism and the impact of colonialism and the notion of migration, because there is the impact, the negative impact of colonialism, but also the reality of people through centuries migrating, seeking better lives elsewhere. And I think it's important to distinguish between the impact of the colonial and state colonialism and distinguish that from the needs of people to find a life of their own. So South Africa has been the refuge of many refugees, then with the complication that the refugees and other migrants arriving then having benefits in relation to the indigenous population and become part of that exploitation process. There's also the issue of slavery, which in South Africa public discourse is not sufficiently regarded. So people were owned as things, starting with Indonesian and African slaves, and that has very much shaped. There were more slaves in the 18th century in the Cape Colony than citizens, and this issue was then interestingly changed. The British took the Cape because it was protecting its trade route to India, because Napoleon had won a war and then had been caught and escaped, and he then went on to being captured again. So we became British. The British then abolished slavery in 1833, which caused the Boer, the Dutch-speaking populations, to flee into the inland and to then meet up and then have complex interactions with the indigenous people, sometimes with agreements, sometimes with violence, and then leading to the discovery of first diamonds and gold. The British Empire itself then became much more interested in pursuing this extractive capitalism. So at the beginning of, or the end of the 19th century, one has the Boer War, when the British tried to recapture the gold on the basis of protecting their citizens who'd come to Johannesburg and other mining cities for wealth, but also part of Cecil John Rhodes' vision of a railway line from Cape to Cairo, painting the entire map of Africa pink and claiming it for Britain. We also then had indentured labourers brought from India, so with very complex history, complex problems around how we all interact. One of the consequences of the Boer War was the immense poverty of the white population, whose farms were destroyed, who had been in concentration camps created by Lord Kitchener. And so much so that in 1929, there was the first Carnegie inquiry into white poverty. So we'll also look at colonialism, when I look at surplus populations and very much poor working class people pushed out of Europe, and refugees who are making their way across the world and then are competing with indigenous populations. South Africa then, mostly because of the Second World War, had the capacity to industrialize also on the basis of our gold and diamonds. And then we had, in 1948, the creation of apartheid, where it was the hierarchy of races was strictly put in law. And when the rest of the world was celebrating a defeat of racism, we were embarking upon an exacerbation of racism with a strict hierarchy of races. And the liberation movements in Africa under the protection of the Soviet Union and China to some extent in the 60s, as liberation movements were working. Harold Macmillan spoke in our parliament about the winds of change blowing across Africa. South Africa was resisting that. But then once again, we get back to the Portuguese. The Carnation Revolution in 1974 in Portugal, when the Portuguese fascist regime was collapsed, immediately led to Mozambique and Angola being given up, and there were civil wars in both of those. But that enabled the liberation movements a foothold right on South African borders, and the intensification of the liberation struggle, and the militarization of the South African state. And someone like myself, as a white conscript, would have been required to fight in that war. And yeah, the next major event was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Empire, actually meant that the discussions around democratizing South Africa could take place to some extent free from this imperial forces, which then led to the freedom by Nelson Mandela, and then very interesting time, the notion of the nation, a rainbow nation, a slightly shallow myth, but also the TRC process, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where to a limited extent people had to confess the wrongs that had been done and received pardon if they had committed those violent acts for political purposes. The TRC is a whole debate which I can't go into here. It probably wasn't pushed through to its logical conclusion. So we have now the notion of a nation state, and then we are struggling how to live together as this complex nation of different colors, different races, different histories. And the reality painted in our beer commercials of happy young men drinking together and enjoying sport probably does not reflect any kind of truth of our actual existence. We have made, I think, significant progress in certainly abandoning formal racial discrimination, but the remnants, the residue of the white supremacy that I was raised with, that needs to be fixed. Our constitution is a lovely liberal and post-liberal document, and then the issue is that a sufficient document on which to base the integration of such a complex nation. Homi Bhabha writes that the narrative of the nation starts with the forgetting, but I'm not sure that is the useful way. I think my view is that one should remember and acknowledge as the basis for going forward. But in looking at my students, looking at young South Africans of all races, we have a culture of consumerism, a culture of not knowing history, of not engaging with history, and the distribution of financial wealth has not moved to a significant extent in the past 25 years. And this is then the born frees, as we call them, those who were born after 1990, now going to university, some of them having been to good schools, having been, in a sense, the French students being citizens of a free country, then running into the reality of the differential of power and reality of that the wealth is concentrated in a particular sense of and yeah, how one engages with that. The Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall movement then started out, in a sense, in my view, as a kind of populist backlash. And I use Dahrendorf's, I'll end on this, Dahrendorf's discussions about populism, because populism simplifies. Populism is simplistic, whereas democracy is complex. So what is required is engagement on the basis of informed social engagement. And Dahrendorf writes that learning to live with complexity is maybe the most important task of democratic education. And in my experience, and I think our reality is that we have not done that. So we are running the risks of populist movements with essentialism, who are then expressed in racist terms. The Roads Must Fall movement, to some extent, has become quite chauvinist, quite anti-women, but also violence. And then literally events of violence erupted at my university's admin building was burnt down as part of the protest. Artwork was destroyed at UCT. And yeah, so we are, in a sense, in need of the next step past the Rainbow Nation, and that is not so easy to achieve. In my paper is an effort to try to engage with that.
So our final paper is presented by Valenzuela-Vermehren, Catholic University of Temuco, Chile. His title is Ideology, Political Order, and Foreign Policy.
Thank you so much. Marvelous being here with all of you. It's a rather rich experience. Background to...
Can't hear.
Oh, I guess I'll have to use this. Okay. Okay, is this on? No. Is it on now? Yeah. Background to my concern for questions of centering on ideology has to do with my own personal experience. And I was in Chile when I was 9 and 10, and this thing called the military coup happened. And as a child, I saw things that normally children shouldn't see. And I started asking myself questions about what are the motivations that people have to engage in this sort of regime change. And later on in life, I went to university and started asking questions about, well, what are the nature of ideas that move people to do such things, and what is power? So this is like sort of background to this. Let's get right into it. The relevance of ideology in the study of international politics is perhaps more significant now than ever before. After the rise of the Soviet system of the Cold War, we bear witness to a steadfast economic, political, and military expansion of Western interests throughout international society. This conference's principal theme, the endurance of empire, would seek to confirm the ongoing concern in certain quarters over what such events mean and their implications for the future of a culturally diverse global system. This expansion is unsurprisingly accompanied by a self-serving discourse that offers the world no escape from the imperatives of an ideology that seeks to graft upon the world a particular view of domestic and international order. In this respect, I posit that it is the power of ideas, as well as material power, that is the cornerstone of any political order. Whether we speak of what one scholars call the imperial humanism of the Renaissance, which unleashed the history of the Spanish Empire, or of the German National Socialist Weltanschauung, which in turn proffered its own view of European order, it had been such ideas or ideologies that formed the point of departure for the development of history. It's impossible to cover here the breadth of the literature on the meaning of ideologies and concepts. However, it is possible to state here simply that ideology, as a term coined by the French philosopher Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in his work *The Elements of Ideology*, this is the era of the Enlightenment, pointed to the task of arriving at a scientific understanding of the nature of the mind, the nature of the human being, in an attempt at determining the proper character of the society in which people should live. One historian said the general happiness so eagerly sought during the Enlightenment could be ensured by the correct engineering of government and society. Ideology, or the science of ideas, would attempt to offer a scientific explanation of the manner in which human thoughts are formed, and in doing so, illuminate the path to true knowledge of human nature, and therewith the means of defining the general laws of sociability. From the perspective of politics, this rational or scientific outlook of the Enlightenment had immediate consequences for the development of ideas related to domestic and foreign policy, as well as repercussions for the development of political ideas later in the 19th century. The charges leveled against the society of the old regime had also become the vehicles of criticism of dynastic foreign policy. One may look no further than to the physiocrats and philosophers for an illustration of this. The latter, scornful of the diplomacy of the ancien regime, saw the resolution of the problem of war as a function of the establishment of an ideal state. And this necessarily involved a radical transformation of both the state and society. I'm going to jump ahead because I have a feeling that I'm not going to be able to finish this. Let's go directly to the question of foreign policy. And there's a way long version of this, about 16,000 words. So anyone wants to get into it, here I am. Within the context of foreign policy formulation, one may make the case that ideologies constitute belief systems that hypothetically shape decision-maker perception, politically and socially, in an a priori manner, and govern to a greater or lesser degree the character of what Robert Jervis, international relations academic, called the psychological review of the policymaker, i.e. his worldview and his perception, interpretation, and definition of foreign policy events, and of the foreign policy formation process itself. Goldstein and Cohen have similarly maintained ideas help to order the world, and by ordering the world, ideas shape agendas which can profoundly shape outcomes. Insofar as ideas put blinders on people, reducing the number of conceivable alternatives, they serve as an invisible switchman, not only by turning action onto certain tracks rather than others, but also by obscuring the other tracks from the agent's view. At the state level, in turn, and in respect of the sources of domestic sources of policy, various elite interest groups exert influence over foreign policy formation. Gabriel Allman early on noted this in his account of the role of political bureaucratic communications and various elite interest groups in the creation of policy itself. More recently, Ripsman suggests that states, in fact, quote, must take into account the demands of powerful political actors, such as the military, economic elites, and even occasionally the public as a whole. My conceptualization of elites follows these assumptions, but also suggests that elites constitute, more specifically, a kind of social power that C. Wright Mills referred to when he suggested that, quote, the power elite is composed of men whose position enabled them to transcend the ordinary environments of ordinary men and women. They are in positions to make decisions having major consequences. He saw the sources of social power as stemming from the economic, military, and political spheres. Similarly, Franz Neumann at the Frankfurt School, lesser known figure of the Frankfurt School, conceived of power as social power focused on the state and state institutions as a means of directing its behavior according to a particular conception of national order held by ruling groups. From this, it follows that elite interest groups are a constitutive element of national power, which influence government and the making of national and foreign policy by deploying not only material interests, but also the ideological interests linked to them. In Hurrell's account of Hedley Bull's thinking of the role of ideas in international relations, he maintains similarly that, for Bull, quote, ideas mattered to the extent that they are taken up and acted upon by powerful states, and the relevance of particular norms and institutions would always be linked to the underlying distribution of material power. To this extent, my conception of state power is both material and social. Power not only implies mere material capabilities and resources, but also the power of influence over the decision-making apparatus and the attendant projection of interests into or onto the international system. As Gould Davies, he was taught at Oxford, he was principally a British diplomat. Gould Davies put it, power and ideology may even be mutually enforcing. Six and a half minutes. Let's see. All right, jump ahead again. Power, social material establishes political standards of international legitimacy, constructs zones and or alliance systems among ideologically convergent states, and determines the nature of friend or foe. More to the point, I contend that powers or ideological policies operate within the global review in a distinctive manner towards other states. As Gould Davies himself rightly maintained, ideological states attempt to replicate aspects of their domestic system within other states. They define security in terms of the expansion of their domestic system and threat in terms of the expansion of their adversaries of the domestic system. One resolution to perceived security threats, hence, is the construction of ideological international orders conducive to doctrinal uniformity or homogeneity between ideologically convergent states and other ideologically distant states within the international system. Security, however, is not the only concern pertinent to the foreign policy agenda of states that see it fit or necessary to expand their domestic system. The purveyors and sources of policy from within the elite structure of states may see expansion not merely in terms of security, but as a functional necessity of the various internal social, political, and economic dynamics and elite interests that make expansion a requisite policy for the maintenance of the social system of a particular ideology. Expansion and systemic reproduction, hence, might be a function of perceived security as well as a requirement for extended opportunities of, for example, affluence or other benefits that accrue from enlargement. This means, in practice, making, quote, international order, quote, itself a function of ideological imperatives and of the projection of social power within the international system, which, as concrete policy, may challenge established and broadly accepted norms that regulate international intercourse. For the late English school scholar of international relations, Martin White, this meant that an ideological power might cast a brand of, quote, revolutionism that, quote, demands homogeneity among the members of international society. It requires doctrinal and structural conformity and ideological homogeneity between states, unquote. This imperative, which is an effort to assimilate international relations into domestic politics. Here, there emerges a kind of universal foreign policy articulated and formulated in the interest of perhaps perceived world civilization, whose interests must be defined and pursued by a power, or alternatively, a group of powers. Intervention becomes a distinctive feature of foreign policy in the transformation of the domestic order of states. This is consistent with Michael S. Wesley's account of the new interventionism in the post-Cold War age. It argues that efforts at the homogenization of the state system involve the provision of prescriptive advice about or the direct manipulation of a state's domestic processes and institutions of government, backed by the threat or the use of coercive measures or conditions on assistance by external states or international agencies. I would add, however, that the legitimation of both essential features of the ideological power's own domestic system, as well as of the policies required for their extension beyond its frontiers, become a chief goal of public discourse. How much time do I have left now? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, we can do this. Martin White's conceptualization of the great revolutionist state holds that, quote, the bearer and exemplar of the new order and its relations with the unregenerate society of states will reproduce the relations of the church militant with the secular and infidel world, unquote. To the extent that this is true, this involves casting aside the tradition of tolerance, if there ever was one, and the ordering principles underpinning international relations that are at least ostensibly a legacy of the Westphalian order. If, as White put it, international society exists by virtue of a core of shared values and standards embodied in part in international law, and if the tranquility of that society rests upon an even distribution of power among its members, then ideological challenges to the order of international society mean providing the occasion for subverting and sacrificing the principles of coexistence by virtue of a stock of ideological tenets and requirements that submits its cause to the realm of necessity and expediency. Ideological orders, I argue, may see fit to appeal to the methods of reasoned state, which, as Francesco Guicciardini many centuries ago famously maintained, represented the knowledge and power, one might add, necessary for the establishment, maintenance, and expansion of the state. Similarly, ideological orders embody the ethos of the Italian ragione di Stato in a greater and enlarged sense by attempting to create an interstate leviathan composed of ideologically convergent or compliant states that extol a new reason of system. I stole that from Alan Cassell. So I don't want to attribute that to him. So it was interesting. Ideological orders then represent a spatial dominance of a particular political and social arrangements brought to fruition by social and material forces that justify and legitimize such dominance on the basis of the progressive or beneficial traits of the arrangements articulated by ideology itself. We'll finish. So the ideological dimension of international relations is significant because it potentially delivers clues about state policies and clues about the conduct of foreign policy on the part of certain states in the pursuit of objectives within the international system. It posits additional variables, to use social scientific language, to explore and weigh against each other when subjecting the foreign policy process and outcomes to critical examination. In sum, it transforms the study of power politics, into parallel inquiry into the ideas that motivate political action in the politics of the international. That's it.
We'll take about 15 minutes for questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, go ahead.
For the first speaker, Quebec. I wonder how Quebec fits your model in terms of the educational needs in Paris and other things. And it's still has a very strong identity with France today, even though the British took over and it became part of Canada. And Canada requires both languages, English and French, to be learned by all the students in Canada. So, and yet, Quebec's unique. So that's my question for you. And for the third speaker, the legalization or the illegalization, the end of slavery, was actually 1838, not 1833 for England. And for the Dutch East Indies, and probably for the Hudson Bay Company, for the British, and for the right, that was the age of mercantilism, where nationalism and the companies were very closely combined, actually. There are port requirements, sales requirements, selling to the home front, things, special relationships galore for companies, and so there really wasn't much of a divide between companies and countries in that mercantilistic era. So wiki mercantilism and read up.
So we're going to just take some.
Sure.
Do that. Okay. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Wonderful panel. And my question is inspired in the first instance by Silvana's great paper, and I think might have potential relevance across for whoever might like to comment. And it starts with that great line from Levinas about ontology being the philosophy of power, which almost, in my listening to the papers, could almost be argued as a kind of underlying foundation for the whole discussion. Because we're talking about metaphysics and politics, it's like where metaphysics meets politics is where it determines how the different dynamics of power are going to play out. And so my question is this: how did Dussel respond to someone like Fanon, who, with that, those dynamics of power in mind, kind of said, hey, look, the level of dehumanization in the circumstances under which we are living is such that only violence is going to get it done. So, you can talk about the face. I don't mean in any respect to be flippant, but just kind of for rhetorical purposes. One can talk about the face-to-face encounter all they wish, but at the end of the day, it is violence, given the circumstances and the dynamics of power under which we live. What would the response be? I don't know if Dussel did engage with Fanon, or what would the response be? And I don't know if Steve and Gideon and Luis, if you guys think that question of Fanon and violence has any relevance for the discussions as well.
It's a question for Gideon. Obviously, you didn't quite get enough time to talk about the Rossouw campaign in detail, but obviously you mentioned it's populist, and it's the opposite to dealing with the complexity of the historical legacy that's pretty mixed up. But the other event that's happening is in the US with regards to the statues of Robert E. Lee and Confederacy flags. So there's, in various parts of the world, battles over the politics of historical memory. So my question is whether you see there to be any merit whatsoever in the symbolic removal of statues and iconography that very directly relates to previous colonial or imperial or skewed power dynamic regimes that clearly link to human suffering, or not.
And then
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your presentations. Enjoyed them very much. I have two questions. First, Luis, fantastic paper. I thought if you have been also relating your points to this new, or not new, but this ideas, epistemic communities that have been discussed, for instance, in Journal of International Organization. Because I think, and maybe further out to the concept of soft power, this, if you could elaborate a little bit. And for Steve, I have a question about the last phase of your historical narrative, so to say. It's about, you said that in the last phase we have a new form of assimilation. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and also maybe related to the particular situation in France after 2015 and the state of exception, or whatever we could call it. So that's my two questions.
Okay. Yes. So, Councilor Paul, please be brief.
The question of violence is a huge question. Levinas is not an anarchist. He is not against politics and against the state, but he says states and politics will always be violent because of its being a totalizing system. It's inevitable. So it will be violent. So we have to remain in the metaphysical sphere, which is before or beyond the politics. And I think it's due to Levinas' Jewish way of thinking, which is he wants to remain in history, but with outside history also. He wants to be with the foot on history and with the foot outside history, and it will be the Dussel's critique of him. If you are in history, so get engaged in liberation processes. If you are not, so don't talk about politics and don't pretend to try to repair the world. But Levinas definitely won't be in both places. So Dussel would say also that the violence is necessary as a response of the violence of imperialism, but he will say we will have to have a violence at the beginning and until another totalitarian, any new political system that we will build will be violent, and that is why he will suggest a permanent situation of revolution, permanent revolution. When we have to change the system will at the beginning will be fair and equal and well and democratic, but it will soon get a new totalization. So let's change the new one, and let's change and the change and change. And he admires Fanon on that.
You want to start?
Well, I have something just very general to say about the question of violence. States expand and intervene in other states, we commonly get insurgence of rebel groups and so forth. Chilean experience is instructive in that regard, in the sense that a patriotic front emerged, apparently tried to assassinate Pinochet during the course of the military regime. Then withered away. There was this transition to democracy. I'm sure there are many other clear-cut examples of how this was a very weak group final analysis, unlike groups in other countries. But violence breeds violence. It leads to resistance.
What I would say is that I think that what our issue in South Africa is that Black South Africans would regard the state violence of the apartheid era as illegitimate, but I suspect a large number of white South Africans actually don't regard it as illegitimate. So there's that tension there between, well, when is law legitimate or not, and I think it's part of the issue. I'm afraid I'm sticking with my dates. In South Africa, in 1833, slavery was abolished. In 1834, it was implemented. The reason then for the Great Trek, so when the Dutch moved into the inlands, my own family moved in 1828, so they were merely tax dodgers. They weren't part of the Great Trek, and they occupied land, so there it is. But the issue was that, well, my history books taught us that the Boers were upset, not because the slaves were being freed, but they had to go to London to get their money. But I suspect, well, that is a bit unreasonable, I think, but yeah.
Well, maybe 1838 for Caribbean or something.
And see, so by 1838, the Boers were making deals with Dingaan, and then we had this moment where, from the Afrikaner perspective, Dingaan reneged on the agreement, and there was the famous Battle of Blood River on the 16th of December, 1838, when, according to my culture, God assisted us in defeating the Zulus at Battle of Blood River. But yeah, so that's our story, but I don't really buy into it. In terms of Samir's question, it's a difficult one. I mean, there's the case of the bells in Germany with Nazi insignia on it that are not being moved. And I also was surprised to discover that in the 1950s, Afrikaans students at UCT, I didn't know this, had actually tried to have the Rhodes statue removed already in the apartheid era. I suggested to the university, I'm alma mater at UCT, I suggested that we should, in fact, the university should have a sculpture competition, and in the place of Rhodes, then every 2 or 5 years have a different sculpture engaging with the issue of identity, and then have a sculpture path where Rhodes would also begin, because Rhodes is part of our history. But I think removing him from the plinth there in the center space, but not hiding him like in the Soviet Union in some kind of black lot. But yeah, but it may be that Black South Africans have a different perspective and then think that Rhodes is so offensive that he should in fact be removed or even destroyed. And yeah, so these are, I think, well, the issue is that South Africans are we are monologues. We're like shouting at each other, and what is missing in our identity is dialogue. We don't have a system of dialogue. So I think using statues and what we do with them as starting a process of dialogue is necessary. It's also necessary for our system of democracy to learn to talk to each other and not just shout at each other. And the risk of the populist wave is that it just continues the shouting at each other process and not engaging in dialogue. So I believe we should deal with the statues in a manner that enables dialogue. That would be the best solution.
The question on Quebec allows me to also answer, to pursue, which I didn't have a chance to develop because it's here in your 15 minutes, isn't it? Just as the generation of the 1930s used French intellectual tools, so the generation that wanted to create local identities, Creole identities, métissage, do a lot of French, the French theory, Deleuze and Foucault, Derrida. So once again, we have the employment of the concepts of the center to develop a detachment from the center. So the first tendency was to try to create to identify through literature, because now, because of the École Républicaine, everybody in the Caribbean is literate in French. And there's a large dimension of French literacy in Africa, although it's more restrained than it is in the Caribbean, the Antilles. But the next tendency was, the critique of that was that even though, for example, in Guadeloupe, the Guadeloupean or the Martinique identity is not only African, and two phases of African influence, not only the slave trade, but after the abolition of slavery, basically the indentured workers now from Congo were brought into Africa. There were Indians from India, what's called in the French West Indies the Syrians from basically Lebanese, Chinese, and there's not only this biological métissage. So an author like Raphael Confiant has written a series of books, and each book tends to focus on one of the components of this Martinique identity, including the influence of the United States on the Creole identity. After all, the Caribbean is in America. And by the way, just an interesting footnote, both Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor say that the invention of negritude comes from the American authors, Langston Hughes and others. They say negritude was really the invention of the American authors in the 1920s and 1930s, which they took and universalized them. The next tendency was to adopt Deleuze's idea of the rhizome. Instead of having roots, the rhizome moves out. And so we have an identity now that draws on not a rooted place, but a more generalized. It's even universalized. So the idea is that there's the local that spreads out to the more general, but there's also the universal, and that's why the authors, beginning with Edouard Glissant, adopt as their own this white son of a plantation owner, Saint John Purse, who was a famous diplomat, by the way, called Alexis Léger, who was the chef de cabinet of Aristide Briand. Because they find in Saint John Purse a Creole writer who, from his locality, finds a universal. And of course, since the Caribbeans are detached, the African, or those of African origins, or detached from their traditions, they build a creolite on the landscape, the traditions, the folkways, a kind of emptiness, but so there are studies by the Creole writers themselves, the Saint John Purse, which find that not only does he use Creole words or references, but his style is Creole, with long periphrases. Just one thing. The reason I think that and the literature from this region is the most vibrant is that the dilemma that these writers faced in both Africa and the Caribbean is to what extent they could use the language of the master for their own liberation or to construct their own identity. So their plan was actually to twist French. So in terms of style, that's what's innovative. They take the French language, they bring in Creole dimensions and Creole style, and they break the language. And that was even the announced perspective of César, for example, and Senghor. And the same for Africa. The famous African writer, Kourouma, writes in a French that's heavily influenced by the Malinke language, for example. And just in terms of, just one other thing, in terms of violence, this is ambiguous because, a country like Tunisia got its independence without violence. And why? Because Habib Bourguiba was so French, and in fact, in many ways he saw himself as French, was so French that he understood how the French functioned. And the French were continually stunned and nonplussed. And Bourguiba was able to negotiate peacefully an independence. Violence was not necessary. The same, one other thing, the same for yeah.
Okay. So we'll just take Paul and Russell, and maybe if you just could make your comments briefly, and that'll conclude the session.
I think for go. I mean, if we need to go to a break, maybe we shouldn't have anything more.
We started 10 minutes late, so go ahead.
Sorry? Yeah. Well, I think Thank you. David, I really enjoyed all four of your papers very much. It was just great. And I don't, the only question that I had was your mention of Hegel and his reception by Levinas. I don't think I completely followed the logic there when he was talking about Levinas' critique of the socializing logic of Hegel and similar sorts of schools of European thought as being a counterpoint, if I understood correctly, to the idea of not completely otherizing the other. Right? And so that Levinas' contribution is to see the self as being centered also in the other, right? But that, I'm wondering, I'm surprised, is this a reception of Hegel, of what Hegel actually said, or like a secularized version of Hegel? Because Hegel's definition of freedom is precisely the ability of being able to see myself as at home in the other. That's exactly what Hegel's definition of what freedom means. So it seems to be precisely in Levinas's own world.
There's a
I think we're just going to take the question.
Okay, I'll make a couple of brief comments and we'll continue in discussion afterwards. I'll just sort of register a kind of objection to the Fanon matter. I think he's a massively overrated writer. He exists because of the Sartre endorsement and because his celebration of violence appeals to adolescent readers. I think a serious discussion of violence would have to involve, is the violent outcome in Algeria better than the relatively peaceful outcome in South Africa, right? And if you want to endorse Fanon, you should say that you wish South Africa had the kind of violence, say, that accompanied the partition of India. Right? That's a Fanonian position. Right? And if you disagree with that, if you think that a relatively peaceful transition is better, then maybe we should take Fanon off the reading list. He's just not that smart. On the question of statues, it's complex, and I wonder, do statues really matter, or is this just people giving money for art projects? But if you're going to look into statues, then let's make it a more complicated field. There's the King statue in Washington. No one's going to call for that removal, but it's interesting that in its construction, it's effectively eliminated all of the Christian components in King's legacy. He's presented as a secular civil rights activist, and the Christian natural law has been purged. So I think there's something deeply problematic with that statue. And there's the statue that Jean-Claude Juncker inaugurated in Trier of Karl Marx. So this is the European Union putting up a statue to Marx. The European Union includes many countries that suffered under Marxism. Should that statue be removed? And then finally, there's been an interesting event just recently at an art festival in Wiesbaden, in Germany, where the administration of the festival put up a statue, a golden statue of Erdogan, as a kind of provocation. And the Kurdish community was outraged, and that's been removed as well. So I think the Silent Sam and Rhodes, because they're plugged into the black-white issue, have a certain kind of rigidity in the possible discussion of what statues are about.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the panel.
I forgot an opportunity to answer Garza's question. No answer to the other question.
Oh, I guess we were supposed to answer everything, I guess. Why
I
don't
just
you
wait
speak to
for
our...
orderly. Well, anyway, my sense of order.
I'm sorry, but we're really way out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you speak to Lars in our break? So we'll have a break now until 11. Thank you very much for coming.